Hello, this is a recording on about Chapter 3, Moral Objectivism. If you would refer to your text, we'll go over this in more detail Wednesday and Thursday when we establish times for our lab sessions, and then those, at least one of those lab sessions will be recorded and placed on the YouTube channel. But there are some reminders, some heads up issues that I want to cover with you today. Most of them turn around Professor Poimon's lack of acquaintance with St. Thomas Aquinas and the doctrine of double effect, which has become quite popular, both pro and con, in moral theory in recent decades. So if you will look at the definitions under moral objectivism, beginning at chapter 3, he defines moral objectivism, and then he defines moderate objectivism and moral absolutism. So he is contrasting moderate objectivism, which he supports. Professor Poimon is one of the leading proponents. Of course, he's dead now. He was one of the leading proponents for moderate objectivism in the ethics literature. But he incorrectly categorizes St. Thomas Aquinas as a moral absolutist. That is simply not true. It's probably beyond our interest right now in this introductory class, the real and deeper reasons that that's true. But it's simply not true, and I want to correct what I consider to be Professor Poimon's obvious inaccuracies. Remember, we just got through dealing with relativism in chapter 2, and objectivism is the opposite, the polar effect of relativism. I think objectivism, at least the idea, is probably far more correct, whether it is moderate or absolutist, than relativism. So some kind of objectivism is true if there is even one moral principle that is overriding. And a moral principle would be something like do not kill or do not steal. But if one of those main principles is true, if there's just one of them, then relativism is proven wrong. And that would be a third argument against relativism. We discussed two when we talked about, both in the lecture and in the lab, on relativism. Now, Poimon spends about, a page and a half on natural law theory. Natural law theory is probably the most well worked out theory in ethics. So it's a little bit unfair of him to cover this in such a slight manner. We're going to devote several weeks later on in the course to a proper understanding of natural theology. I still want you to read this, but we're going to do a deep dive into natural law theory. We'll focus on that later on toward the end of our class. So today I want to focus on his claim that the doctrine of double effect is a workable thesis in ethics. I don't think it was. It was never intended to be, and that will be made clear in our talk today. Now, this whole idea of the doctrine of double effect, or as most people refer to it as the DDE, I think that Poiman ends up referring to it as most often as the DDD because it's long to write that out. It occurs in Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologia, the Secundae Secundae, which is simply in Latin the second chapter of the second part, question 64, article 7. Now, I've given you, or will give you, a citation. You see it here in blue. I'm going to place this whole document that I'm looking at here, I'm going to place that on announcements in Blackboard for both section 100 and section 101. But this quote, this section here that I have included in its entirety in this document comes from the newadvent.org edition of the web edition of St. Thomas's Summa Theologica or Summa Theologia. Just for your background, maybe you're not interested, probably you're not interested, but just in case you ever run across this again, there's a proper way to cite, just as there's a proper way to cite quotations from Plato and Aristotle, there's a proper way to cite the quotations from the Summa, the great Summa here. There are three parts. Prima pars, part 1, secundae pars, and then tertia pars, first part, second part, third part. The second part has got 2 books, so it's normally referred to as the Secunda Secundae, or 2:2. It comes from question 64, article 7. And here's the citation from New Advent. The question that Aquinas is raising in this section concerns faith, hope, and charity. We've talked about the ethical virtues, which are justice, prudence, moderation, and courage. They're called the Greek virtues. St. Thomas calls them the cardinal virtues, not the red virtues, but the cardinal as the post that holds things up, the top of the post, supporting a portico or a porch or an eave. So those are the Greek virtues, the cardinal virtues: justice, prudence, moderation, and courage. The religious virtues for St. Thomas are faith, hope, and charity. Charity is sometimes translated as love. There's a problem there because love in English just simply doesn't work out to be the thing that St. Thomas is talking about here. He's talking about actions done out of concern and respect for others. That's caritas in Latin, or translated as charity in English, which is further translated as love. So he's not arguing for a type of ethics here. That's what Poiman and almost every commentator on the doctrine of double effect misses. And I don't want you to be part of those people who simply miss what St. Thomas is trying to say here. When he's talking about virtue, he means actions, things doable by an individual person. Now, granted, he's talking about the good things that are doable, not the bad things, but the good things that are doable, that are in the character of someone who is virtuous, but it's not an intellectual and not an academic notion of philosophical ethics that he's talking about. He's simply talking about good actions here. So he's not pursuing the question, what is a moral theory, but simply, what is the human will capable of? And we know common sense, in the common sense fashion, what the human will is capable of. It can do evil things, or it can do wonderful, good, and essential things. So his question in this section is not about a moral theory, but what kind of behavior is consistent with an adequate moral theory. Now, the problem that Poiman has, and it's not, I'm not singling Poiman out here, it's simply a failure of modern people to look at the source and adequately deal with the literature here. Uh, he's not looking for something like a categorical imperative in Kant that we'll talk about later, or the consequentialist principle in utilitarianism, the greatest good for the greatest number. So the doctrine of double effect would not, in Aquinas at least, replace the need for either a categorical imperative or a consequentialist principle, as I said, that we'll study later. It's more of a applied ethics than it is a moral theory. Now remember, we talked about there's moral theory, there's meta-ethics, and then there's applied ethics. So what the writers of ethics textbooks are doing is confusing applied ethics with either moral theory or meta-ethics. That's exactly what Dr. Poiman is doing here, and it's not intellectually honest. Well, it may be, but it's done out of ignorance, I think. I don't believe they really go back and read the source, because they developed this idea of the DDE from one simple article here, Article 7, and the only question in that article is whether it is lawful to kill somebody in self-defense. So there's not any moral theory here that's developed in this section of the Summa, where everybody says the doctrine of double effect comes from. That's the simple point I want to make here. Now, I will include this under announcements um, in Blackboard. So I'm going to give you this quote. Now, I would appreciate it, and I think it would be good for you if you read this whole thing. It's not that long. He first asked the question whether it is lawful to kill someone in self-defense, and there are some objections here. This is the way that Aquinas pursues everything. He gives you all the sides of the issue. So objection 1, objection 2, objection 3, 4, 5, these are all different answers to that question. So he's giving you the plethora, the entire universe of possible answers to that question. And he's citing references in Scripture and other philosophers for the reasons for those objections. And then he says, on the contrary, and in Latin this is sed contra. This is where you know that Aquinas is going to give you his take on this. So anytime you see on the contrary, sometimes it'll just be in a translation, it'll be sed contra. He gives you the contrary to all of these objections, 5 in this case, and then he answers the question. And I've highlighted the essential part here of his answer and his replies to each of these objections. So the point I'm trying to make here is that this one particular facet of this third chapter is absolutely wrong. There's no doctrine of double effect in St. Thomas. This comes from a later philosopher that followed St. Thomas Aquinas, called John of St. Thomas. And yeah, from certain Catholic and academic philosophers that have picked up on this and attack moral objectivism on this basis, but it's an incorrect way to proceed. So the doctrine of double effect, the DDE, is not an absolutist theory of ethics. It only concerns one little question of whether self-defense is ever an ethical solution, whether the good person can kill either intentionally or accidentally to save his or her life. So the doctrine of double effect, at least in some conservative ethicists, and again, it's not so much people like Poemen that don't get this. Some conservative commentators and even some Catholic theologians and ethicists that are interested in St. Thomas don't get it either. This is not, and let me repeat this is not a fundamental principle of ethics. It was not intended to be. It's simply a strategy for proper reasoning. How does a reasonable person approach the question is the real question of what St. Thomas is trying to do here. Because Part 2.2, Section 64, Article 7 that I've presented in whole here is a discussion of law and not moral theory. This whole section, the second section of the Summa, has nothing to do with philosophical ethics. It is simply the application of law. It's not theoretical at all. It's a question of the applicability of laws and how general concerns influence laws. And as you know, anyone taking political science, the law eschews theory. The law is not so much interested in theory. If you get caught for doing 85 in a 35 zone, the officer is not interested in your theories for why you were doing that. Law does not concern theories. Now, the philosophy of law does, but the applications of law does not. And that's kind of thing is what's going on here in St. Thomas. So the real point of this lecture, as you read Chapter 3 on moral objectivism, is that the doctrine of double effect is not a moral theory. Poemen assumes that it is. Most people who both support it or argue against it don't understand the context in which it is presented. So I hope that's clear. I want you to be, I want to be forthright with you as you start reading about objectivism in this section. Poemen claims to be a moderate objectivist. So as you read this chapter, understand that that's where he's coming from in his arguments. But he fails to he misses the point here that instead of being an absolutist, St. Thomas Aquinas is a moderate objectivist like himself, although much more astute, I think, and much more creative in his answers to what natural law is and where it comes from. And again, we will pick that up in a couple of weeks from now. You don't have to be concerned with that right now, except for the fact that this is a slight take on natural law, an incorrect, uh, an incomplete observation about natural law, and an erroneous assumption about St. Thomas Aquinas and what he is up to. I will totally fill you in on this when we move toward the end of the course, as I've said, into natural law theory. We're going to devote a lot of time to that as we study Plato and Aristotle. Cicero, the great Roman orator who was a proponent of natural law, and then St. Thomas, that kind of culminates and fills in everybody else's um, inadequacies when it comes to an understanding of natural law. So I hope that's helpful. This document that I'm referring to here will be up on the on Blackboard. Well, let's see. I'm going to put the lecture up this lecture up on Monday, but I may put this document up um, before then, so that you can have it visibly to refer to as you read through the lecture. So I hope that is clear, and that you have a good weekend, and that you stay safe. I'll talk to you later.